welcome to About the Author. I'm your host, Teresa Sheffield. We are here at Westsider Rare and Used Books on the Upper West Side in New York City. We have a very special guest with us here today. She is awesome. Her name is Joanne Lipman. She is the author of That's What She Said. She is a veteran journalist. She began her career at the Wall Street Journal, where she rose up to be the deputy managing editor, and she became the editor-in-chief of USA Today, and then the chief content officer of Gannett. Thanks so much for being here. It's great to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I love this store, so it's great to be here.
This store is great. Like, honestly, if you guys are ever in New York City, you should come by here. It's just like wall-to-wall books, floor-to-ceiling, covered in books. It's just like the most organized hoarding I've ever seen in my life.
It's like a combo of between Harry Potter and Beauty and the Beast.
Yes. No, it really is.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, when I walk in here, I just, like, I imagine this is what, like, George R.R. Martin's, like, inside of his brain looks like. That's what I feel like. Firstly, I have to say, so when I saw the title of the book, I was like, I'm immediately on board with anything that is a reference to Scott Carell's character on The Office, because that's, like, my favorite. We were talking about it, and actually, you don't watch The Office. Your son is a fan of The Office. That's where you get it from?
Yes, so my son would, obviously That's What She Said is a dirty joke. Right. So for years I would hear my son, anytime you say something, as you
That's
know,
what she
that's
said.
what she said. and anyway, but it's double entendre, the title, because it also applies to what women experience. Like probably every woman has experienced that thing where you're in a meeting or you're in a group and you say something and nobody seems to hear it. It's like crickets. And then 2 minutes later, some guy repeats exactly what you just said, and everybody turns to him and they're like, "Oh,
Brilliant.
Bob, you're
my
a
God.
genius." And Bob gets all the credit. Bob, what a great idea. And the women in the room are saying, "Wait a second, that's what she said."
That's interesting. That's a perfect title. Also, I mean, Scott Carell been a great case study for your book. It's
That's
just
true.
terrible. That's so interesting. Actually, I remember reading something about how the women in Obama's White House solved that. Did you hear about this? Where it's
Yes, and I talk about that, and that's what she said.
Oh my gosh, do you want to tell us a little bit about it? It's so interesting how they solved it.
Yeah. Actually, this is one of the strategies, because in That's What She Said, I end with, I really wanted takeaways that were very practical. And so, best practices that we can put into action right now. And one of them did come from the Obama White House. So the women in the Obama White House, even though Obama had more women than any other president before or since, the women still felt that, they were in the minority, and they felt that they were often bulldozed by the men in the room. Nobody took their ideas, or it was attributed to a man. And so they, between themselves, they secretly came up with a strategy, which is they called amplification. And the idea is that you would say something in the meeting, and I would immediately repeat exactly what you said and say, "Oh my God, Teresa, great idea." And so what that did is, first of all, it made sure that your idea didn't die on the vine, that people heard it. And it also, the second thing is, it made sure that you got credit for your idea and that Bob didn't get credit for it 2 minutes later. So, and it's amplification. There's another one that I should mention briefly, which was a similar, this came from a consulting firm. Some women at a consulting firm told me that because women, all the research shows women are penalized for talking about their own accomplishments, but whereas men are rewarded for it. However, women are, because it's seen as sort of, when you talk about yourself, it's seen as out of character of the female stereotype. However, women are really great at advocating on behalf of others, which is much more in their stereotypical female kind of behavior. So these women at this consulting firm created a strategy that they call brag buddies, which is, I tell you about my achievements,
I love
you
it.
tell me about your achievements, and then we each go and brag about the other to our bosses.
That's so smart.
Yeah.
It's like using the system against the system.
Yeah.
Oh, get it, girls. It's amazing. Awesome. It's such a great read. It's very entertaining, but it's also just so full of wisdom. So what were your thoughts when you were writing it?
Sure. So I've been working on That's What She Said for 3 years.
Wow.
And yeah, I actually started it because women talk amongst ourselves all the time about these issues that we face at work, right? Things like feeling marginalized, overlooked. You say something and nobody seems to hear it, just not taken as seriously as men. and we talk amongst ourselves all the time. And there are books and we have conferences, but what we haven't done is talk to men about it. And I really feel like women talking to each other is half a conversation. And it's only at best going to solve half of a problem. And if we really want to solve the gender gap, we need men to join us. And also, you know, I worked with men for most of my life. I started my career, as you mentioned, at the Wall Street Journal, where most of my colleagues were men and my mentors were men. The people we were writing about were men. And, you know, these were generally very, very good guys. My mentors were amazing men. And I really do feel like there's an awful lot of guys out there who would love to be our allies if only they knew how. And so I really want to reach out a hand and talk about the issues that we face, kind of lift the kimono a little bit and let them in, because there's so many things guys don't understand about what women experience every day. And I want to let them in, and also then look for solutions, like real tactics that we can bring to the workplace to fix these problems.
That's really what I found very interesting when I was reading it, because it's not like a lot of other gender, inequality books that I've read. It's because it's directed at men. It's for men, but like it's in such a conversational tone. And it's like, I mean, could you ever expect to like solve gender equality without men,
Right.
It's like a little bit like, just like trying to solve the problem of like who's pooping on your floor without like addressing your Labradoodle. You know what I mean?
It's exactly right. Very good analogy.
You have to talk to them, right?
Right, exactly. And for the most part, they're good guys. I mean, right now we are focused very heavily on these extreme cases of sexual harassment and sexual predators like Harvey Weinstein. And it's great that we are able to talk about those issues, raise those issues, and that there are consequences, which there were not always consequences before. But that is really sort of the tip of the iceberg kind of problem, because that's the extreme. And while not every woman experiences sexual assault at work, thank goodness, but every woman does know what it feels like to be disrespected. And generally, if you have a workplace that's turning a blind eye to those extremes of sexual harassment, you also have a workplace that you can bet is underpaying women and not valuing women and not giving them opportunities for promotion. But what I wanted to do with the book really is, so that's what she said. I spent 3 years, I crisscrossed the country, the world, seeking out primarily men who were trying to reach across the gap, and talked with them about sort of what did they learn. I wanted just to tell stories, and there's tons and tons of data in the book. There's about 50 pages of research notes in the back. But what I wanted to do within the context of the book is tell really great stories and bring my own life experience to bear and make it much more conversational, and at the end of the day come up with what are some solutions. It's a pretty easy read. It's a quick read. But at the end, there's actually a cheat sheet at the end that says, hey, here's 12 things you can do right now today that will help close the gap.
That's amazing. That's really good. And actually you mentioned, so that was my favorite thing about it. It was just like, it was totally different from any other book about gender inequality I've ever read, and I really liked it. And you mentioned in your book why you decided to take that approach. You were actually on a flight, and you were drinking white wine, as one does on flights, and you had an interesting experience with the person sitting next to you.
Yes. So I was on my way to Des Moines, and I found myself sitting next to a businessman, and we had our little plastic glasses of white wine, and we started chatting. We were having the nicest conversation. And, this guy was telling me about his new house in Westchester and his kids and their sports teams, and he was
so relatable.
It was like he was, he worked for a bank. I mean, he was a very nice gentleman. And then he turned to me and he said, "Hey, why are you going to Des Moines?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to speak at a women's leadership conference." And suddenly he freezes. He gets that deer in the headlights look, and he's like, "Sorry, I'm a man." And then he proceeds to tell me about how he had just come off of 2 days of diversity training at his bank. And he said it was 2 days of just feeling like he was getting beaten up and sent to the principal's office and sat in the corner. And basically he said the message that he and the other men took away from this training was, it's all your fault. Which I thought, what a shame, right? What a wasted opportunity. And so the next day, I'm speaking at this leadership conference in Des Moines, and there's a whole ballroom full of women, and we're talking about the issues we face every day. And I see a sea of female heads nodding up and down. And I just stopped in the middle of a sentence and I said, you know, we all know this already. We actually need men in the room to hear this. And so that really got me thinking. I ended up writing an article for the Wall Street Journal that was titled Women at Work, A Guide for Men.
Which went viral.
That went viral.
Right.
And then that in turn led to That's What She Said.
And what I love about you're a great writer, and it's very conversational. I love your anecdotes. But like you said, she does a lot of research, 50 pages worth. And one of the interesting studies that you included was a Harvard study where it was that corporate diversity training has actually made the gender gap worse because it makes men feel demonized.
Yes.
How so? Tell us more about that study.
Yeah, so this Harvard professor did 30 years, he looked at 30 years worth of diversity training at more than 700 companies. And he concluded that for women, as well as for African American men and women, it made things worse. And there were multiple reasons why, but a primary reason was this resentment that the white guys felt like they were being beaten up. And it made them feel that things were not fair and that they were being punished. And so they came out of the training and they either sort of said, okay, I'm done with training, I'm fixed, or they came out of training and said, I'm pissed, right? And it made them resentful. And so they felt that the world wasn't fair and that things were stacked against them. And so as a result, this professor concluded that actually for women and African Americans, their situation at work would have been better. They would have succeeded faster had there been no training at all.
Interesting.
Which is why now a lot of people now do this unconscious bias training, which is unconscious bias has now replaced sort of standard diversity. Diversity training, a lot of it was based on like legal compliance and here's what the law is. Unconscious bias training looks at, we all have these biases, men and women and minorities. We all have biases that are sort of built into us that are so deep that we don't even know that they exist. And so unconscious bias training, the idea is you are supposed to kind of reveal what these biases are. And once you're aware of them, you actually can take steps to counteract them. So, but it comes out really early. This is not something that just starts in the workplace. And we talk a lot about that, and That's What She Said. This is really important. This starts so young, and it starts at home. So one of the studies that I cite in the book that kind of blew me away is about mothers of infants. So mothers routinely overestimate how quickly their baby sons begin to crawl, but they underestimate how quickly their baby daughters begin to crawl. And then 2-year-olds, parents of 2-year-olds who type into Google, is my child a genius? Which is so something I would do. I admit it. But anyway, parents who type that into Google are more than twice as likely to type that in for a baby boy as a girl.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a lot of this research that shows that it just starts really young. One of the most amazing was actually about first graders, where they had first graders take a math test, and they took the names off the papers, and then they gave the papers to first grade teachers to grade. The first grade teachers went no names. The girls in the class outscored the boys. And then they put the names back on the papers and they scored them again. And this time the boys outscored the girls.
Wow.
So it's just this, it's not like the teachers were sexist. Actually, the teachers who were doing the grading were women.
Yeah.
It's not like they were overtly sexist, but there's just this sort of internal thing in there that gives the boys the benefit of the doubt.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so heartbreaking.
But once you're aware of it, you can
Yeah.
actually do something to counteract it.
Because
I mean,
it's so
that's the
deep.
main thing. Yes.
What do you say to women who say, like, just going back to like the diversity training, like men really didn't like it. Like, what do you say to women who say, you should feel bad. You're doing bad things, Maybe don't feel like a victim. Maybe just change. What do you think made it a negative experience for them? Was it how the training was given? Or was it just like the facts of that? Like what about it was negative?
Well, there were a couple things. I mean, I think that the training really started in response to lawsuits back in the 70s,
So it
way
started
before
a
our
negative-
time. It started as
on
a
a negative
negative.
thing.
It
Yeah.
started as a negative. And in fact, and it started with legal compliance. And even I talked to this man who's been doing diversity training for 30 years, and he said, look, when we started, that's what we did. He said, we beat white guys over the head with a 2x4 and tried to make them feel bad. So clearly that was the genesis of it. And then, it has since come, and then it became sort of more about a thing about being politically correct. And of course it's the right thing to do to have equality in the workplace. But what's interesting is I spoke to so many men, I spoke to hundreds of people in writing the book, looking for those best stories to tell and best practices to take away from it. And the men who I spoke to, while of course equality is a worthy and important goal for society, but what they said is, look, at the bottom line is I run a business and my business needs to be successful. And almost all of them said, I'm solving a business problem. And they all use the gym class analogy. They say, if you and I are the team captains in gym class, and I can only pick from half the room, but you get to pick from the whole room, like, your team will win. And so and there's all this research, by the way, that shows that when you have more women in leadership, you're more financially successful. When you add women to work teams, those teams are better at problem solving, they're more creative. So every piece of research shows that you need, for business financial success, competitiveness, you actually need to have those diverse teams.
Yeah, it's not just like a nice thing. It's like, you
right.
can be better.
Exactly. And by the way, so much of the research in That's What She Said, a lot of the research was actually done not just on women. A lot of it was done on what you would call any underrepresented groups. And of course, every underrepresented group has its own set of issues. But there are so many shared across the board of, the lack of respect and the not being heard. And then, for women in particular who belong to also another underrepresented group, it's even more severe. If the wage gap for women in general is, 80% of what men make, for African American women, it's about 64 cents, I believe. For Latinas, it's only 54 cents. Versus what men make. So there's this double bind, it's called, where if you belong to sort of two underrepresented groups, it becomes even that much more severe.
I mean, so shifting gears a little bit, one thing I really admire women like yourself who came up in the workplace when it looked a lot differently than it looks today. What I look at when I, as a millennial, go to work, it's totally different than anything you ever saw. You know what I mean? And like, you guys really, were trailblazers, and you created the world that I benefit now. So I would like to thank you guys for doing that. But it's also interesting, like, so what would you see, like, just, anecdotally, like, what would you see, like, going into work that you would never see now?
So, well, first of all, I need to thank the women who came before me.
Yes, totally.
They're the ones.
Absolutely.
They're the ones who really started it all. But here's a big difference. So when I started, one of my first interviews I ever did, I started right out of college as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. One of the first interviews I ever did, the man, who was a business owner, brings me into his office, locks the door, and strips to his underwear.
What?
Yeah, no kidding, right?
Joanne, what?
So it was
kind of Mad Men.
It was
crap is that?
It was, on the one hand it was terrifying, but on the other hand, I will tell you, this is before Anita Hill. So Anita Hill happened in 1991, and this is a couple of years before, and sexual harassment was not a thing. I mean, there was like rape, but sexual harassment, I'm not even sure I'd ever heard of the phrase. And so I was like, okay, if he doesn't attack me, I am not gonna let him rattle me. So I took out my reporter's notebook and I interviewed him in his underwear. And then
Joanne, you are bad. You are a bad girl. I love it. Like, seriously, like, you are badass.
Yeah. So I went back to my office and I
love it.
I told my editor about it, and he laughed. Right? He was like, "You're a badass.
Yeah,
like, that's awesome."
How embarrassing for him, because he was expecting a reaction from you, probably, I
was determined to not get him that reaction that he wanted.
What was his face like? What was he like? Like, what did he do?
He was like, kind of playing it cool, and I just like interviewed him and got the hell out.
That's hilarious.
So,
oh my gosh.
So, but you fast forward to now, right? And so that's the big difference, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean, I was like, yeah, I'm
Wow.
standing my ground, buddy.
That's amazing.
And I felt proud of it, and I was not traumatized by it.
Yeah.
But fast forward to now, and if that happened, frankly, now that I'm an editor and I manage people, if a young woman came to me and told me that happened, my instinct would be not to laugh like my editor
No.
did, but to call the police.
Absolutely.
Right? So I do think there has been
Oh my
progress.
gosh.
I do think there's
Wow.
been progress.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that I really liked in your book, and you have such great research, was something that you mentioned. It was a UN Women's ad about Google. Your Google research
Yeah.
is great, and honestly, like I feel like you can tell more about a person through their Google like search history more than
Oh,
anything
yeah.
else. Like I wish it was required in like a Tinder profile. That would just be great.
That's a great
It would be
idea.
so great. But I loved the research that you had. It was a UN Women's ad where if you type in "woman shouldn't," you see what auto-populates. And what auto-populates, you type that in, is they shouldn't have rights, they shouldn't vote, they shouldn't work, they shouldn't box, which I found very strange. Like, where does that even come from?
I know,
Also,
it was
Ronda
a weird
Rousey would,
one.
I'm sure, just like destroy that. And then also another one was if you type in "women need to," what auto-populates is be put in their place, know their place, be controlled, be disciplined. So, I mean, whoa, that's crazy. And like, how do we like? What does this say about like what people say publicly and what they actually think? Because it seems
Yeah.
like two different things. That's very telling, right?
Very, very. I mean, Google's auto-populated search is sort of a measure of our unfiltered thoughts.
Yeah.
So yes, very telling. The other thing that's interesting though about Google, which I looked into with Google searches, and basically all of the algorithms that rule our lives on Facebook and social media and Twitter, everywhere. The Google search is basically our unfiltered thoughts. Google algorithms that show us when we do a Google search, algorithms are a language. They're written by people, and the people who are writing them are generally men. And that has an impact as well. So whenever I go and speak to groups, I will do a Google search, just a visual Google search of whoever they are. So I was I was visiting with my agent the other day. So I typed into Google Hollywood agent, and oh my God, it's 100% men. The pictures are 100% male.
Uh-huh.
All my agents are female. Like everybody I've ever dealt with in an agency for books or for film or anything like that, they're all female. But it comes up totally male. So same thing with doctors. If you do doctors, I did for That's What She Said. I had been speaking while I was writing it, and I was speaking to a group of executives, and I typed in CEO. The only female photo in the first page of Google searches was CEO Barbie. So, but
horrifying.
it has an impact.
Oh
So
my
the
God.
algorithms have an impact. The other thing that has a huge
Wow.
impact is the fact that our organizations, our media, film, television, all entertainment, are primarily run by men. And that also has a huge impact on how we view the world and view ourselves. And I think there's a great example of that is if you think about just a couple of years ago, Bill Cosby, who is in court accused of drugging and sexually abusing multiple women. But think about where you learned about that. It was likely from People Magazine, Entertainment Tonight, the entertainment pages. It was a sex scandal. Now, fast forward to just, this fall with the beginning of the Me Too movement, and when Harvey Weinstein, that news came out in the New York Times and the New Yorker, I give tremendous credit, of course, to those amazing reporters who broke the story, but also to their editors, because what their editors did is they didn't say this is a sex scandal. They understood this is a societal issue that goes deep. It's deeply rooted in our society, and it's something that we have to systemically work on to root out. Things like this had never been treated in that way before. They'd always been treated as like sex scandal, salacious. And I attribute that largely to the fact that men have controlled the message.
How do you think? I mean, it's just interesting, like how much can be lip service. Because, like, I mean, after the Me Too movement, like men won't say certain things, they won't do certain things. It's just not going to happen. But like, how do you, make sure it's not just like lip service, where like it is really a change within like their hearts and minds, where it's like, people should be equal. How does that happen?
Well, that's the whole point of That's What She Said, is to make all of these issues discussable, because that is a huge piece of it, is just getting men to engage in the conversation and inviting them into the conversation, and when they're not comfortable, coaxing them into the conversation. And I think that would be, there's a potential positive and a potential negative. The potential that comes from Me Too. So the potential negative that we have to avoid at all costs is what you hear, rumors and rumblings that men will say, well, I'm never going to talk to a woman, I'm not going to hire women, I'm not going to mentor women, and that would be the worst possible outcome. Like, that would set back gender equality years, if not decades, right? So that's incredibly important that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
What That's What She Said is all about is hopefully the reverse, which is to make this an open discussion, to get away from the fear. And by the way, there was a survey done of business executives that said what might stand in the way of you championing equality at work, and 74% of the men said fear. And part of it was fear of loss of status, but part of it is fear of saying the wrong thing. And if you've probably seen this yourself, right? Any woman if you've ever been in a mixed gender conversation and equality or parity, any of these things come up, you'll see like the women are comfortable talking and the men sort of clam up, like, not my topic. And or fear of saying the wrong thing. And so we got to get over that. That's what I hope is the outcome for That's What She Said.
So the timing of this book is pretty awesome, right? I mean, like, how long have you, my guess is you didn't just, like, this book didn't, like, just happen. Like, you probably working on it for a while.
Yes, so I was working on the book for 3 years.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, and in fact the publisher moved up the publication date. The publication date was supposed to be today, February 15th.
Oh my gosh, happy publication day.
Thank you, but it was moved up to January because after the Me Too movement exploded, we just started getting all sorts of incoming, requests for the book to talk. I mean, this is such an important issue, and because what we've done so far has been, in the press and the media, what we've been great at so far is exposing the problem. That's What She Said is all about the solution. And so people have been just really eager to start saying, okay, what next? What's the next step?
What other, like, resources do men have other than, like, your book? Maybe, like, talking to, significant women in their lives? Like, what other resources do they have?
So one of the things that I tell women, actually, there's a lot of companies that now have these women's groups, like women's employee resource groups. And whenever I'm invited to speak to one of these groups, I will say, please bring men. And I see that some of these employee resource groups, these female groups, are now inviting men regularly. And I think that's great because it exposes them, it gets men and women together in a different kind of environment, in one where all of these issues are discussable. And it also forms bonds between men and women that they might otherwise not have an opportunity to create. And when you do that, it makes people feel better about their organization. It makes it more likely that the women will get promoted and will stay. It really helps with sort of retention of your employees. Because a big reason why particularly male-dominated companies lose women is because the women don't feel a connection to the company. So, and that's usually because the company is run by men. And so you have to work to make sure that you forge those personal connections.
Well, Joanne, happy publishing day. It was a pleasure having you on our show. Best of luck with your book. I'm sure it'll be a smash success.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.